I think too often people just go bonkers. Like I have friends that have 800 bottles, right? So
No.
like, what sort of triggered you to think, all right, this is good. I could drink all day, like breakfast, lunch, dinner. Like I don't care.
You can't drink out of this class for shit.
Well, the problem, actually, James, I'm sorry to get rude so quickly as you.
I'm gonna bring up Ohio at any given cost.
Nobody should be putting this stuff in their body.
I smell metal and grease.
The perfect bourbon is Michter's 10-year-old.
Oh, that's junk. Oh, that's junk. Yeah.
So our topic today, people, is we are going to discuss beginning a whiskey collection. And this may or may not be relevant to some of our listeners. Probably a lot of our listeners already have whiskey collections, but this will be helpful in algorithms, for YouTube, for TikTok,
you're playing that game.
I
like it.
We're appealing to the man.
And I think this is fun for me even to think about. Like when you sent that yesterday, I was like, holy shit, I haven't thought about that in a long time. And you realize how many dumb things you did along the way that you would do differently now. Yep. So I think it's going to be a fun topic.
Yeah.
I'm assuming we're going with the scenario that somebody's already tried enough whiskey to know that they like it and they want to start amassing a collection for not only them to drink, but also to have friends over and kind of to collect. So we're already past the point where you've tried a lot of the basic shelf stuff.
Right.
And you want to start collecting.
Right. And so the way I framed this question to James was, let's talk about the 5 whiskeys that you feel like you have to have in your collection. And that's not necessarily 5 specific whiskeys, but that's right. So that's like how do you cover your bases? And then when do you feel like a collection is complete? And right. And so this can mean different things to different people, just like the perfect bourbon argument. Right. So for me, and what I've, assorted here is just kind of representative of this. I still think that, and this is how I started my whiskey collection. When I first did it was, the first bottle of whiskey I bought was an Irish whiskey. And then because I was a poor college student, I just bought bourbon because it was the cheap, that's what I could afford.
At the time. Yeah.
Starting out into my whiskey journey, I bought mostly bourbon. So I think you got to cover your bases first, right? Because even if, let's say you know that you like bourbon, you've tried several bourbons at bars, at friends' house, or whatever, and you're like, I want to get into whiskey. I want to, start drinking bourbon. Well, but is bourbon your favorite? You don't know yet, right? And certainly you'll be enthusiastic about sharing your whiskey with other people, having other people over, and bourbon may not be their favorite, but you still want to have that experience together. So I think the best thing you can do is to cover your 5 bases first, which is a bourbon, a rye, an Irish whiskey, a Scotch whiskey, and then a Scotch whiskey that's peated. Now, you don't necessarily need to buy all of these at first. Like if you've tried one and you hate it, don't spend money on having it in your collection, right? Like if you've tried a peated whiskey before and you're like, that's just terrible, don't necessarily buy one, add it to your collection right away because it's just going to sit there for a while. But some of these are acquired tastes. The first bottle of peated whiskey I bought, Lagavulin 16, I thought was terrible. And I was like, man, I blew $90. I'm going to have to drain pour this. That really sucks. But I forced myself to drink
Which is what I've never been able to do.
Because it was $90.
So you're like, yeah, this was a huge investment.
That was my first the only really expensive bottle I had at the time. And I was like, I all these people say it's good. It must be good, right? But it really was. It was just the taste was so foreign to me that my body rejected it at first, and then I grew to love it.
Your body was smart then. It's gotten dumb as you've drank more and more whiskey.
Got some Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah,
for the peat.
I took a similar approach, but so what I wrote down on my sheet, I thought this was an interesting question and something I hadn't thought about. So I actually got out a piece of paper and I jotted down some notes. I left Irish whiskey out.
Oh,
because
you think it's too similar to Scotch?
I do. And I think if you generally like something like a Speyside Scotch or a Highland Scotch, the odds of you liking Irish whiskey are probably pretty high too. And there's just not as much variability in it. And so I left that out. So what I would say is, so I had 3 rules. All right.
Okay.
My rules are not to buy anything sourced.
Oh, that's smart.
So only buy things that are actually being made at the distillery.
Ooh.
All right. 2, with the exception of Scotch, don't buy anything that's finished.
Oh, okay.
Because that's going to throw you off, because the flavor profiles are going to be completely different. And that just, to me, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Like, you want to stay sort of center lane with it. And the other thing is, I would buy from large producers to start with. And I say that just because I think that's going to be more representative of like classic bourbon flavors,
right,
than if you go along the lines of like, you know, a craft whiskey and you jump into something like Watershed that has a lot of funk to it. I'm gonna get out my notes here. What was the other thing? Yeah, and I would stay away from things that are allocated, because you don't want to get caught up in a hype machine.
Yeah.
And I would go mid-tier. So I'd go 40, 50, $60 tops.
Oh, see.
Kind of in that range.
Okay.
Again, this is assuming you've already had a lot of lower tier stuff and you've
Okay.
tried it and liked it, and you know you want to kind of step up your game a little bit.
Yeah.
That's where I would go.
Yeah, and I guess that's fair, because $50 now is $30.
It is,
10
yeah,
years ago,
yeah.
right? So, yeah, I think that you added a good point that I didn't think to verbalize, but was to go with classic flavors first. And so that's where I kind of got my 5 categories from, right? Because I think if you get Irish whiskey, it's very close to a lot of the lighter scotches. And some people find it a little more approachable because it is triple distilled, and it's almost always at 80 proof. So it's a little bit lower proof even than a lot of scotch. But the thing about the cast finishing, I do think is important, because you're right. There's maybe not so much with scotch, because I think scotch kind of falls into 2 categories primarily, which is bourbon barrel scotch and sherry cask scotch.
Right. Sherry's too much of an integrated part of what scotch
Right.
is to completely eliminate it. But for bourbon and rye, I think it's easy.
Yeah, for bourbon and rye, I certainly agree, because and also I would say I agree with the allocation point, because you don't want you're starting a collection and you either feel compelled like, oh, I need to find the rare allocated stuff first. I need to save my money for that, because you'll be sitting around. Either you'll be blowing way more money than you need to get very average bourbons, And like my friend's boss just got into whiskey like a year ago. He bought a bottle of Elmer for me. This is the only time I've ever flipped a bottle, but I was just like, he wants to pay me $300 for it.
Like I can't say no.
I'm like, I can't say no. It's not worth it. I even texted him. I was like, it's Elmer T. Lee, dude. It's like a $30 bottle. And he's like, I don't care. He's a CEO of a company. He's super rich. He doesn't.
That's
$30.
That's $30.
Right. Exactly. And so I was just like, all right. But I wouldn't do that to like a normal person. I wouldn't be like, no, you want this fancy bottle of Elmer T. Lee that it's super rare. It's worth $300.
Right. And the reason I put it in there is, one, I think when you're first starting your collection, you don't know what you like yet.
Right.
So there's no point in going out and dropping extra money on something that's probably marked up in price.
Yes.
And so stick with things that are more readily available that you can find
and repeatably buy.
Right.
If you do find something you like.
Right. And I think this is a good opportunity then, you go through it, whether it's the 5 categories you laid out or the 3 categories I laid out. And I broke up scotch into sort of Islay Scotch and then something else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think then you can kind of find the flavor profile that you gravitate towards and start to expand from there. And that's when I would start to look at, all right, let's go into different mash bills. So let's try a wheated bourbon.
Yep.
Let's try something that's cask finished. If you're going with rye, let's try something that's 95 or 100% rye and something that's lower rye.
Yeah.
Like you can start to sort of mix and match. And then I put, sprinkle in these other bottles. Cause like you said, people are going to come over and you're always going to want to challenge your palate, but that way you can start to build your initial collection around a core of bottles that, a year from now, you're not going to look at and be like, why in the hell did I buy that?
Right.
Like you're going to still want to go back and drink them.
Yeah. And so my 2 rules were buy a couple bottles from a different style first. So bourbon, rye, scotch, it doesn't need to be 5 bottles, but get at least 3, of slightly different styles. My second rule is do not finish your bottles. Under no circumstance are you allowed.
You want to keep some samples.
Exactly. Are you allowed to drink beyond the bottom 20% of any of your bottles until you buy the next bottle in the same category?
You're mean.
No.
Because you want to go back and you want to try side by
Right.
side with the new ones you're adding.
Yeah, because this is what drives me crazy is I know people that get into whiskey, right? And they're like, oh, but I don't really know why I like, this or that. And I'm like, well, have you ever tasted them side by side? And they're like, no, I just buy the next bottle after I finish the first one. And I'm like, well,
That's why. Yeah.
That's why.
And you don't remember. And especially
Right.
as you get further along, you and I have had thousands of freaking whiskeys at this
I
point,
remember
right?
them all, James.
Yeah, I bet you. I bet you do. You lose track of that's why I said about the E.H. Taylor single barrel. Like it had been years since I tried that.
Yeah.
And I tried it and I was like, all right, yeah, this is why that was one of the first bottles in my collection. Like it's a damn good bottle for that price point.
Yeah. So don't finish your bottles.
But I didn't listen to you and I don't have any left. So I did finish them.
Now the problem is I've maintained that mentality forever. And so I just have 1,000 open bottles in my collection. But the point is don't finish your bottles right away, because when you buy that first bottle of Four Roses small batch or whatever, and you're like, I kind of like bourbon, I want to try another bourbon, and you go and you buy Knob Creek 9-year-old and you open it up and you're like, ooh, I like this more than I liked the Four Roses. But you won't know why if you finish that bottle, right? And that's critical, because now you're going to finish your Knob Creek and you won't know what to buy next.
Or you might not even know if you like it more or not, because
Right.
you don't have a direct comparison to
Right.
it. So
It might just be, it's the new thing. And a lot of times that whatever the new thing you taste is, it'll be like, oh, that's really good the first time. And you might not like it as much over time. So keep back a couple bottles until you have a good little collection of, 10, 15 bottles. And I would say that's probably all that's a good limit.
yeah, I
most
put
people need.
10 to 15 bottles as sort of like to start.
Yeah.
And I was saying big brands. So for me, I was thinking like Wild Turkey, 1792, get some Heaven Hill stuff, maybe try some
Yep.
Elijah Craig. Though those are good, like JD single barrel stuff are good for the bourbons. For the rye, High West, JD does a fantastic rye that's a good price point.
Right.
Pikesville, you have a Willet. Out here, I brought a Knob Creek rye. Like those are all examples of really good bottles that you can get in that price point. And they're all going to be a little bit nuanced. They're all going to have a slightly different flavor profile. And it's going to give you a good lay of the land in terms of, what is bourbon, what is rye, and which parts of it do I like.
Yeah. Cause so just trying this very old Barton versus the Knob Creek 9-year-old, the Knob Creek's way oakier.
Oh yeah, tremendously.
And I would hazard a guess 8 out of 10 people would like the very old Barton more.
Especially if you're just starting.
Yeah.
And I sometimes, I'm glad you brought that up. I was we play trivia every Thursday because I'm a nerd. And we went and we were playing trivia, and the only thing they had was Knob Creek. And if I'm in a pinch, Knob Creek is fine with me for a pour. But I forget sometimes how oaky it tastes by
Right.
comparison to some of these other bourbons you drink. But it's 9-year, right? So it's going to have some decent oak on it.
Yeah. And if and if this was my only bottle of bourbon, it might kind of make me, I like it enough, but I wouldn't really know what to buy next, because I wouldn't have a frame of reference, right? And this is especially critical because like the earlier on in your journey you are, the more reviews are going to be critical to you, right? Because you're not going to know, you're going to read a review for something like this Willet, which let's taste the Willet next. I'm going to make James drink it. I don't think he wants to, but
Is this the 4-year?
it's the 4-year.
No,
rye.
this is
or 3-year.
3
rye.
years. Oh boy.
Oh,
This is going to
boy.
be fun.
It's like 56% ABV too.
At 3 years?
3 years rye.
Oh, goody. This is going to be chewy.
Dude, this this is an intense whiskey.
Yeah.
And I chose it for that reason, because this is a whiskey. My buddy bought this. It was his second whiskey purchase. He regretted it instantly.
How much are these? I don't even know. 40, 50 bucks?
I think it was probably 40 or 50 bucks at the time. Yeah. It wasn't that much.
And I would say this is a good point here too. Play with your proof.
Right.
Get some that are a little bit lower, get some that are a little bit higher. See where your range falls. Because I think people get caught up in not just chasing the allocation. They also get caught up in what they hear people like us say. And I shit all over 90 proof whiskeys all day on the show.
But that's just because you're so used to drinking
Right,
really high proof.
right. To me, it just tastes like water. For a lot of people, that's going to be perfect. So try some things across the board and get some different ranges and see where you fall.
Yeah. And this to me is like the most rye whiskey.
Oh man,
Dude, it is just
that's like chewing on rye seed.
Yeah, and straight up cinnamon red hot. Like,
Mhm.
oh, it's just crazy.
It has a little bit of that dill though that you sometimes get
Mhm.
with younger rye, and then you start to get a little bit of the caramel at the end. But that's a very youthful, kind of brash rye whiskey.
It's intense. Like,
Yeah. If you don't, that would not be a good bottle for somebody
right,
who has not had rye.
right.
So
And so, I brought it out as an example because, he bought it and he was just like, oh, crap, I hate rye. And so it's like, you gotta realize, like, at the beginning, you're going to buy some bottles you don't like because you don't know. Like, they're not all going to be hits, right? And the more you taste, the more you're going to know kind of your palate, and go and read reviews and taste the whiskey while you read the review. Don't read the review and then go home and drink the whiskey later. Read the reviews while you taste the whiskey, because you're going to find certain reviewers who you're like, oh yeah, I do kind of get a little bit of an apple or cinnamon or, caramel or vanilla or, whatever. And, oh, they like that whiskey. I like that whiskey. They didn't really like that whiskey. I go try it at a bar. I didn't really like it either. And then you can kind of trust them to guide you a little bit with your purchases. And then as you get to know what you like, then you don't need that anymore.
yeah, and just don't go crazy. I would follow like one or two people. Like
Right.
Breaking Bourbon is a good source.
Whiskey Uncut.
Whiskey Uncut is a really good source.
Malt Mondays.
No, Malt Mondays is garbage, but the other ones are fine. But I would pick one or two sources that you really like and follow along. I think you brought up a good point about bars. Use bars, use friends
Yep.
to try new things. Don't just go out and randomly buy bottles. Be
And-
about quality over quantity when it comes to the start of your collection.
Yes. And the thing a lot of bars will do that they don't tell you, they'll do half pours for
Yeah,
you.
yeah, absolutely.
So, which I didn't even think about it early on. It wasn't until I started trying more expensive whiskey at bars that I was like, can I get a half pour of that?
yeah, and in
But-
some places the laws won't let them.
Right.
But in other places, yeah, they're more than happy. It's the same thing for them, right?
Yeah.
So they're more than happy to give you a smaller pour,
Yeah,
something to try.
because there's like no labor involved in pouring a shot of whiskey, right? So, it's not like making half a cocktail. But yeah, because one of my birthdays, I was like, I've got $50. I really want to try Macallan 18, and I really want to try Macallan Rare Cask because I want to get one of those bottles like for my birthday present to myself. But they're both $300 bottles, and
You're not going to buy both.
I'm not going to buy both, and I'm not going to buy one of those without having tried it
Yeah.
first.
No buyer's
right?
remorse when it's $300 purchase.
Right. And I'm like, but I can get a pour of that for like $45 at a bar. But I was like, but I can't spend $45 on one shot of something. So I just asked the guy, I was like, can I just get a half a shot of, like, not even a half a shot, like a half ounce of each of those? And I got to try Glenmorangie 18, Macallan 18, Rare Cask. Got to try like 4 bottles that were all $200 bottles for the price of one shot, for
Yeah.
$45.
And you would much rather spend $45 or $50 doing that
Yeah.
than making an error on a
Right.
$300
And-
bottle.
Yeah. And then I was easily able to tell that, like, okay, now I know which one I want to buy and go buy the bottle or not buy or, whatever. So use bars to your advantage, because even though you are paying a markup, as soon as you get beyond the $50, $60 bottle, depending your budget limiting and your wallet, is obviously, it's all relative. But as soon as you get past like the average value into the more premium bottles, you don't want to have buyer's remorse on anything. And you don't.
Yeah, and trust me, I got more pissed about a bad $40 purchase when I first started my collection than I do now about a $200 purchase. And it's not because I have infinitely more money.
Right.
It's just because like you're new and you like want things and you want to try new things. And so that brings up a point to me that I was curious to ask you about. Do you think, okay, I'm going to ask this in 2 levels. Are you more picky about whiskey now or when you first started?
When I first started.
Yeah, I'm much more picky now.
No.
But okay, maybe the second one will give me the answer that I'm seeking here. The second question would be, do you find that you like a wider variety now, or you liked a wider variety when you started?
Liked a wider variety when I started.
Really?
Yeah. So it's this weird opposite effect where,
Yeah, because I'm total opposite.
where,
on that.
well, besides peated whiskey, because I didn't like peated whiskey.
Yeah.
But I think I liked a wider variety of whiskey when I started, but I was less able to appreciate each whiskey for what it is, if that makes sense. And I think now I'm able to appreciate because I understand like fundamentally what each style is. I understand stuff about the distilleries, what they're trying to do, right? So like now, if I drink Glenmorangie, I don't like Glenmorangie as much as I used to. I loved Glenmorangie when I started, right? It's super light. It's very approachable. Now, to me, it's just, it's too simple.
Yeah.
It's
yeah.
not
No, I get that.
It's not complex enough, right? But I understand that about it, so I don't expect it out of it, if that makes sense, right? Whereas I think when I was starting, I had preconceived notions about, okay, well, the GlenDronach 12, like the 15 must be better than the 12 because it's 3 years older and it's $40 more. So like, it's got to be like 50% better. I think I had that mentality about it, where I was more likely to be disappointed or like overly amazed by a whiskey early on because of that. But I will say now I'm way choosier about what I just actually drink for enjoyment. Like,
Yeah, I can see that.
Like, I don't drink whiskey just for enjoyment as much anymore because I've had so many that there's a much narrower selection of whiskeys that are like really good enough where I'm like, I just want to drink like a whole glass of that.
Yeah. No, I hear you.
I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does. I think what I was thinking was most people, when they start, fall in love with a category and you can't get them out of that category. Like, especially bourbon drinkers, right? They get locked into bourbon. Rye tastes like shit to them. Scotch is garbage. Like, don't even mention Irish whiskey because it's like the redheaded stepchild of Scotch.
Right. And that's what most people do. That's why I always try and get people to buy one.
Right. And so most people start very narrow. And then as they drink more, they become more appreciative of these other styles and their collection starts to expand and the breadth of things that they enjoy starts to expand. And that's what happened to me. I started primarily drinking bourbon. Rye was a little bit rough for me when I first started. But then once you start to develop your palate, then rye slipped in. And then I almost like rye now better than I did bourbon.
Oh, that's because you're dumb.
I know. And and now like you've gotten me to the point where I don't hate Scotch. I won't say I like it, but I don't hate it. So I guess the breadth of things that I enjoy and that I will like take time and sit down and sample has gotten wider, but I'm pickier about what I drink. And so I think now I'm a little bit more choosy about, I dissect everything, but just because I dissect it in a bad way doesn't mean I'm not going to drink it.
Yeah.
It just means I'm being hypercritical of it. But I'm less likely to have the extremes. Like I'm less likely to hate something now, and I'm less likely to love something now. I tend to fall in the middle of the spectrum more now.
Yeah. And it's funny you say that because I think when I was first starting, I was so adamant about analyzing every whiskey I would take like copious notes on them and tasting notes and stuff.
Yeah, you have like 5 books around here just
Yeah.
stacked full of notes.
I don't do that anymore because I think I've had so many that I don't need to analyze a whiskey so specifically to know when it's good or not. And maybe that's like the best way to phrase it, but it's like I can just smell it and I'm like, that's a great whiskey. Now.
I'm just so tuned
And-
into picking barrels and
Yeah.
trying to pick
And-
things
And
that
see, that's the thing. I think you've kind of
Yeah.
you've put yourself in a situation where you have to go back to that. And now part of that's also though just because I kind of stopped doing reviews for Malt Mondays. I just haven't had time. So because if I'm reviewing a whiskey, I do that. I get really analytical on it. But just generally speaking, I more just pick bottles that I'm like, yeah, that's really good, and drink it. And
yeah.
and
I find myself
I
just
enjoy
being
it a little more.
Yeah, I find myself just being more snobby though. Like I'll be sitting there and especially like if I go out to a restaurant and Erica's like, "Oh, like, do you want to get a pour of whiskey?" I'm like, "No, it's all shit. Like I have better stuff at home. Like why would I pay $15 for that, you know?"
Yeah, that's
So
true.
you just get a little bit more snobby and like I don't drink a whole lot just to drink whiskey either. Like I don't go home off my shelf and like pour a glass every night. Like it I really like it when I drink it, but to me it's become more of a thing I do with friends.
Yes,
My collection is stopped, which is I guess a good point to get to. Like when do you know it's stopped? Like so how many let's set a context here. How many bottles do you think you have?
So the last time I moved them, I counted them, and I think it was 160.
Jesus. Oh my God. I think I'm pushing 100, but that
Yeah.
includes my own shit.
Yeah.
So I think I probably have, 60, 80 bottles
But-
of like other stuff.
I have only bought I think 3 bottles in the last 2 years. So or the last year and a half.
So it's really slowed.
since 2022.
Yeah.
Yeah, I decided I was like I'm not gonna have I'm not gonna be buying any more whiskey. Like the only thing I've bought is like Lagavulin Distillers Edition because it only comes out. I've only seen it to buy once in the last 5 years, so I bought it. I really like that whiskey. I bought a bottle of Kentucky Spirit after our bourbon awards last year
Yes.
because I was like, that's a really good bottle. I've bought bottles to do tasting events because I do private tastings for people. So I've done bought bottles for that, and then sometimes there's a little left over, so I keep it. And that's actually a big reason why my collection inflated was doing private tastings, because I would buy bottles that I wouldn't necessarily want to have like just for myself, or they're repeat bottles of something that I know is good or tastes a certain way to format a certain tasting. And then I have the leftovers. And so,
Yeah.
so I end up acquiring third full or quarter full bottles, where I never had the full bottle.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of the same way. I think, I acquire a lot through the business because when we travel around, people give us samples.
And we've gotten sent stuff for the podcast.
Yeah, and we've
too.
gotten stuff sent
So,
for
like,
the podcast.
I've bought maybe 2 bottles of New Riff in my life, and there's like 7 bottles of
Yeah,
it sitting
yeah.
around.
And so you get to the point where you don't really need to add to it. But was there a moment where you knew like, all right, this is where I'm done now, like where you felt content with what you had? Because I
Yes.
think too often people just go bonkers. Like I have friends that have 600-800 bottels,
Yeah.
right? So
No.
like, what sort of triggered you to think, all right, this is good?
What what triggered me is I think the chase of acquiring mid-tier bottles never ends. That like bottles that you don't feel guilty about drinking. And for me that's $50 to $100, right? I don't feel guilty about drinking those bottles. Everything over $100, I'm like
You don't want it. You
I'm
mean
like-
drinking it as you don't want to buy it, or you don't want to open it?
I don't want to finish it, right?
Oh,
So,
okay.
So like, because like I'm sitting here and it's like Wednesday night. I'm like, am I really gonna pour myself a glass of $400 Balvenie Ton 1509? Like, no.
Oh, you're gonna pour for James. That's what you're gonna do. You're saving for James.
Man, you look so smug when you said that.
Because that's like the only scotch I like.
Dude, that was like straight up that Dos Equis most interesting guy in the world. That smirk, like no, but you know what I mean, right?
Yeah,
It's
I
like
gotcha.
it's like a Wednesday afternoon, and like nothing exceptional in my life has happened today. Like I'm
You're not celebrating,
right.
you
I'm
know?
not gonna pour a glass of that, right?
Yeah,
And so what triggered that for me is the moment that the first time that I had a special occasion, and it was like my birthday or my graduation or something like that, and I was like, I don't have a bottle that I'm like, oh, that's what I get to have tonight, because I have like 30 of those.
yeah.
That was the moment, right?
Yeah. So you realized. So at that point, you realized that
my special bottles weren't special anymore.
right. You had a lot of what would have been special bottles
Yeah.
in the past.
Yeah, because like I look at my bourbon collection and I'm like, oh, I want to have a glass of rare bourbon tonight. And I don't have anything super rare, but most of my bourbon is at least somewhat like I have a Four Roses limited edition, a couple of those. You know, I have Michter's 10, though that might be gone. You know, I've got Eagle Rare, I've got Blanton's straight from the barrel. You know, like very few of my bourbons are like typical just off the shelf bourbons, although I bought some for the podcast. But that's just because I drink bourbon less. So if I do buy it, I wait to buy something.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. That
more
makes
rare.
sense.
But it's like, I don't just have one really nice bottle of bourbon where I'm like, oh, that's what I'm going to have to celebrate. You know, I look at my scotch. I've got like 30 bottles of scotch, not 30, but I've got 10 bottles of scotch that are $300 or more.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's like, if I have a special occasion, an anniversary,
Yeah.
or
What do
whatever,
I go to?
what do I, and that is so like, it makes me sad because it's cool to have like nice bottles. But the first like 5 years that I was drinking whiskey, my collection had like one bottle over $100 in it. And every time I like pass an exam or, you know, something happened, I was like, awesome. I get to have a glass of Redbreast 12 cast strength tonight. Like, you know, that like I've been looking forward to it, and it made it so much more like enjoyable and special. Right.
I can see you doing like one push up and getting super excited. And like, I'm going to go have some Redbreast 12 cast strength because I did one push up.
Yeah.
Like I made up for all those calories.
But you know, it's one of those things where it's like and that's why that was going to be my final rule is never rush ahead to the end.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
Of like, because it's really easy to have like that FOMO of like, well, the old scotch is disappearing, it's getting too expensive, or the stag it's getting too rare, it's getting too expensive. And I even thought that 10 years ago. I was like, man, Tommy is offering to sell me a bottle of stag for $400, but geez, I can't spend that much on stag. Like, it's probably going to come down in a couple of years. And now it's
Now you
2000.
wish you had.
Now I wish I had. You
Yeah.
know? But you know, there's always great whiskey available.
Right. And I think that's
And-
what, for me, the discovery of craft whiskey played part into my stopping my collection for
Yeah.
that reason. You start to realize that there is a lot of really good shit out there. And so why am I chasing these things? And I think for me, the moment I realized that I was done collecting, and I still add bottles, like especially if I go to a distillery and they have a special release, I love it.
Yeah.
I totally geek out
that-
on special bottles from
Yeah,
distilleries.
that's what I'll still add is like
Yeah.
the one-off releases where
Absolutely.
it's like, okay, this is the 2019 where they decided to do a different cast finish or
Right.
something.
But I think what really ended it for me was when I started to realize I was being disappointed by more bottles than I was liking them. Like I would go and I'd spend $80 and I'd get super excited. I go home and I try it and I'm like, it tastes like bourbon, you know? And you're like, it's okay. I'd give it a 7. And when I got to the point where I was starting to be underwhelmed by a lot of them, I realized, all right, I'm to the point now where odds are that I have something better on my shelf than what I'm going to spend this money on. So why would I do that? Like, it just didn't make any sense to me anymore. The second thing was you're going to find that you start with a small cabinet and you get to a bigger cabinet, and then you get to a bigger cabinet.
And then you have a room, which is
Yeah,
what we're in.
Like right now, my entire wall of my kitchen is nothing but whiskey.
Yeah.
It's overflowing to another cabinet. And Erica just looked at me and was like, well, yeah, we can't do any more of this. Like this is it. Like we look like a bar.
Yeah.
And so I got to the point where I was like, yeah, all right, it's getting kind of stupid.
Yeah.
And then when I didn't want to chase shiny things, and I just didn't get excited about it. To this day, if I ran into something like a birthday bourbon, I would absolutely buy it.
Yeah.
But I would buy it just for to bring on the podcast and be like, let's talk shit about birthday bourbon. You
Dude,
know?
So yeah. So I had a birthday bourbon. I got to try it one year on my birthday, and it was great.
It's
I really
good
liked it,
stuff, but people pay ridiculous amounts of money for it. But it's like, yeah, I still add special bottles. I add things that are memory bottles,
Right.
like when I go to a distillery, and I love to have the distiller sign it and bring it home and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I'd tell you right now, I could see a whole pallet of Blanton's and I'd walk straight the hell past it. Like I wouldn't even blink, or Michter's 10 or whatever. Like
Yeah.
I just walk. I might buy a bottle for you just to give you shit, but otherwise I would just walk by pretty much everything.
But yeah, so for me it was definitely the realization that I now have too many special bottles that none of them are special. I mean they still are special. They're still really good whiskey, but they don't have like a place in my collection where it's like that's the special bottle in the collection.
Yeah. We go back, whenever we have a big thing with
So-
Two Souls, whenever we sell, out on a release or we get a gold medal or something like that, I always pour us a little bit of Stag. Because to me, Stag is just always going to be at a different level than anything else. But I'm eventually going to run out of Stag. Like I don't have 15 bottles squirreled away like somebody does. So it's like, it just changes. But I think you're done when either A, you're getting yelled at a lot because you're taking up too much space, or you start to be disappointed in a lot of your buying. Because then what's the point, right? You have so many bottles, just enjoy them for what they are.
Yeah.
And start to branch out to stuff that's one-offs and unique and that's discussion pieces.
I will say the second harbinger I'll say is if you're so you're done when A, stuff you don't know what your special bottle is for special occasion. B, you're disappointed in more purchases than not. And I would say C, when you buy stuff and you don't even open it when you get home.
Oh man.
That dude. So I can't.
If you're staring at it, quit.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
quit.
Because I can't tell you over the last 4 years before I stopped buying at the beginning of next year, I can't tell you how many bottles because I would say I bought a bottle a month. That was kind of just what I set for myself. Like I'm not going to buy more than a bottle a month. That's not too much money to spend if your average bottle's like $70-$80. And I certainly am not even drinking close to a bottle a month.
No, you're still going to accumulate.
I'm still accumulating, but I would like buy stuff. I'd like find something cool and I come home and set it on my shelf. And like 3 years later, I'd be like, I never opened and tried that. No reason why.
Yep, it's still just sitting there.
Others-
I have bottles like that too, especially like random store picks that I did. And I was involved in the pick. And so I got a bottle and I just I know what it tastes like.
And it's like, I'm not staring at it because it's rare or
No,
anything. It's
no.
just because I have 75 other open bottles.
And like, why would I open it? Like, when it seems too laborious to walk over and open your bottle, you should quit collecting the bottles. And I will also say too, please do not collect with the idea of that you're amassing some sort of like wealth. All right. We've talked a little bit about whiskey as an investment, but don't start your collection like that because you're not going to enjoy it as much. Start your collection around stuff that you want to drink, that you want to share with friends, that you want to talk about, that can help train your palate.
Unless you're a stamp person. If you're already into stamps,
Maybe
maybe that'll work for you.
But otherwise, like, enjoy it. And then later on, when you're snobby like us, if you really want to go after stuff and collect them and do rare stuff, fine.
Yeah.
But it's not whiskey until you open it. It's
I
just a
agree.
bottle.
Yeah.
So, enjoy it for what it's supposed to be.
Yep. And just as a closing thought, I would say whiskey does deteriorate in the bottle, especially when it's mostly air. So consider that, like that was another consideration I had as I saw the last time I moved my collection, because that's the other way you'll know. Part D, as soon as you move, you'll find out whether you have too much whiskey.
Well, that's when the wife's like, there's like 18 boxes stacked
Yeah.
up and
Yeah.
they all weigh 200 pounds.
Yeah. And,
So,
and it takes 50 trips. But yeah, the final thing I would say is just there was a point where I realized I have a lot of stuff that's like close to the end and I'm not finishing any of it because I'm just used to having it in my collection.
Yeah.
And I don't want it to go bad. And I have so much open stuff that like I don't know what to prioritize. And I tried to make a spreadsheet to like keep track of when I opened.
That lasted about a week and a half.
Yeah, that did not
Yeah.
last. I was like, there's way too I just tried to put in all the whiskey I had and gave up halfway
Yeah,
through.
it's not worth it. I'm gonna go home and count bottles because I'm
You want to know
interested.
now?
But I will say this too.
We'll get back to people
Yeah.
on final bottle count.
Well, yeah, we'll
next
get
week.
final bottle count. I agree with you on flavor, but I will say that that's because you have a really good palate. Like you can tell the difference between a bottle that's just open and one that's been sitting there for a long time. Most people when they start won't know that.
Yeah, I'm more
but-
talking about like higher end bottles.
Yeah,
Where
yeah.
once you have several of them, if you keep them around for a long time, you're missing out a little bit.
Yeah. No, I hear you.
But yeah.
Yeah. So go out. I think we have some good rules. Rewind. Do people rewind anymore? What do you
No.
do?
I
Scroll
just
back.
I stitched
Just-
together the bullet points.
Yeah,
for
scroll
TikTok.
back and listen to some of the tips, but I think these are good. And this is the kind of shit that I would have liked to have heard when I was starting my collection, because I ended up with cabinets full of crap I didn't want to drink. And then what are you going to do with it?
I do. I have a whole shelf down there of stuff I don't want to drink.
Yeah.
But again, this is what I was talking about. Your 5 whiskey, you're kind of covering your bases at the beginning. Even though I don't personally drink those bottles, they all get drunk eventually because I do tastings and I bring out stuff like this Willet that I don't particularly like that much, but it's a good instructional tool for my palate. And I use it to train my palate sometimes to compare against other rye whiskeys. I use it at tastings or when I have people over and I want to give them an example, because I've done tastings before and I'm like, here's a rye whiskey, here's a bourbon. And someone who's really new, they might be like, oh, the rye whiskey doesn't taste that different from a bourbon. And it kind of makes me realize like, okay, I guess the difference between those two is too nuanced. Here's a rye.
This is
like
a big
capital RYE rye whiskey, you
Yeah.
know? And they're like, oh shit, yeah, that tastes completely different. Like, you know.
This would be the last thing I say because we're running long, but this
Yeah.
is what I do. This is fun. People come over and they're like, I want a cocktail. I'm like, all right, well, I can make you pretty much any cocktail you want. So tell me what you want and I'll make it. And they'll say, I want an old fashioned, but I want it to be like a really good old fashioned. I'll be like, I'll tell you what, I'm going to make you an old fashioned with $100 bourbon. And in parentheses, tastes like shit. But I'm going to make you this amazing cocktail with this $100 bourbon. And just to show you how good an old fashioned can be, I like to do that because people are scared to use like a really expensive bourbon. But
I am.
if you don't like it and you're not going to drink it anyway, who cares?
That's
Mix
a good
it,
point.
use it for something different, right? And it does actually make the cocktail usually a little bit better than if you were using a base one. So if you have some of those that you regret, just because you have an investment in them, don't be scared to use them for other things because
true.
otherwise you're just going to stare at it.
Yep. That's
And
true.
give them to people who don't know any difference.
Yep.
Like in-laws.
I feel guilty doing that though. I don't like to pour bad whiskey for people. So
But if it's in a cocktail, they don't know the difference.
in a cocktail.
you know?
Yeah, that's true. In a cocktail.
Yeah, they're just like, hey, this is a really good old fashioned.
Oh yeah. But I don't, it's like my friends come over, it's like, oh, here's my shitty bourbon that I don't like. Don't do that to people.
Well, if they don't know the difference, you could just say, you know enough about whiskey
Yeah.
that people trust you anyway. So if you were like, this is the
This is
best thing
amazing.
ever, like they'll be like, oh, it's really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Confirmation bias.
Like I taste Loganberries, and they're like, "Oh, me too." What the fuck's a Loganberry? But I taste it.
Vegemite. Or, what was it? Digestive biscuits. That's what it was. Neither of
digestive
us knew what it was.
biscuits. Yeah,
All right. Well, that was a fun one, James.
yeah, good to talk about.
Yeah. Although I noticed you avoided tasting the Ardbeg.
Yeah, there's no way I'm drinking Ardbeg. I'll taste that like Friday.
Yeah. Okay. Well, until next week, guys, remember, drink, share, enjoy.
Cheers.